Okay, Year 10. In today's lesson, we are carrying on with our topic, the living world, and we're going to be looking at global ecosystems. So in the last few lessons, we looked at what an ecosystem was and the relationship between biotic and abiotic organisms. We then looked at local ecosystems. We looked at a hedgerow and a pond. And we looked at the changes and the impacts that natural things and also human factors can have on ecosystems. Now, what we're doing today is looking at global ecosystems around the world. Now, a large-scale ecosystem is actually referred to as being a biome. So that is a key word that we will be able to define by the end of the lesson and identify where we find these biomes and why they are where they are. So we're going to describe the distribution of local ecosystems and describe and explain the characteristics of global ecosystems. Okay, so what I would like you to do first is have a go answering these questions around the screen. So you might want to pause the video here and have a go answering the questions. Now, I would like you to answer one mild question, which is a green box, one yellow question, which is in the yellow box, that's a medium question, and one hot question, which is in the red boxes. So use everything on the screen to help you, but let's do a couple of examples together. So the temperatures near the equator are hot, and that is because the sun's rays are more concentrated here. So if I drew the sun onto my image, that suggests then that the equator is going to be the hottest place on Earth. The next one then, using the names of continents and compass directions, describe the location of the tundra. Now, to work out where the tundra is, we need to make reference to the key. And the tundra is this light blue colour, which we can see all the way along in Canada here. We've got it in Greenland, in Iceland, and then also in Europe and in Russia. Okay, so you're describing the location of the tundra using your compass points. And then have a go at completing the other questions using everything on the screen. If there's any questions that you can't answer, maybe write them down, and then by the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer them because we are covering things like this one here. So this is a tropical rainforest, explain why it rains every day in Brazil. We're going to be looking at that throughout this lesson. So pause it here, complete the questions, and then carry on watching the video. So what is a biome? A biome is a large region with its own individual climate, plants, and animals. And the climate determines what the biome will be like. So if we were looking at 4 biomes, I'm going to focus on the tropical rainforest. So we have the tropical rainforest, which we can see here. And the tropical rainforest is very hot and wet, which means that there will be lots of plants, lots of animals, because of the amount of photosynthesis and vegetation that is available. Then we have the deserts. So the deserts we can see are this grey colour, and the deserts are still near the equator, so they will be hot, but they're very dry, which means that there is limited plants, and we get kind of low-lying plants, cacti, and also limited animals. So we get animals that are nocturnal, so they sleep in the day and roam at night time when it's colder, and other animals like the camel. Then we have other examples such as the tundra. So we can see here this red area is the tundra, and the tundra is very far away from the equator, so it's very cold and it's very dry. Okay, so they don't get a lot of rainfall here. So we also get in these locations cold deserts. So the animals and the plants that live here are going to have to be able to adapt to this environment. And then other examples we have are the tropical savanna. So we can see here the savanna is this like whitey yellowy colour. So this is the savanna. Some people put H on the end, some people don't. And the savanna is very hot And kind of similar into the desert, it's dry but does have more rainfall than the desert, which means that there are going to be more plants in the desert, but they're still going to be competing with each other for food and water. So make sure, please, you've written down the definition for a biome and you've given examples of these 4 different biomes. So you've described the location of tropical rainforest, the desert, the tundra, and also the savanna. So I will underline them here so you know what you are looking for. Okay, and then you can carry on with the video. So here are some global ecosystems that we are going to be looking at in this lesson. The tropical rainforest. So if you look at these images here, you can see it's very dense and very rich with vegetation, and that is because the amount of rainfall that we get in this area, which means that there's a lot of photosynthesis occurring, and the vegetation is obviously then going to be very rich and plentiful. The tundra we can see is quite sparse, so you can see very far ahead of you, it's very open space. The plants are very low-lying, and that's because it's very windy, so they need to be quite close to the ground, and it looks very cold and very dry, so the plants here are going to have to be quite hardy in order to survive. Then we have the desert. So the desert is similar to the tundra in the sense that you can see vast open land, but it's much drier, and you can see that from the sand. And the plants here, they look very dry, very sparse, they're very spread out, and that's because if they're close together, they're going to be competing for water, so they need to spread themselves out so that there's less competition for that. And then we have the savanna. So you can see the savanna is still very sparse, so there's lots of sand still, the ground looks very dry, and you can see that in this top right image. As the animals are walking, they're picking up lots of dust from the ground, and the plants are very far apart. So, you know, if you want to live in the savanna, the animals are going to have to be very fast, they're going to have to be very good at catching their prey. So there's going to be lots of predators, and they're going to have to be able to adapt to these environments. So make sure you've got some notes with the last task about the different types of plants and animals we find in these ecosystems. Okay, so we're going to focus now on where we find deserts and where we find tropical rainforests and why that's important. So we can see that the deserts are found along the Tropic of Cancer, which is 23.5 degrees north, and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is 23.5 degrees south. Okay, so they're still near the sun, so that means they're going to be very hot, but it's very dry, and we need to know about why that is the case. Now, if we look at tropical rainforests, so I'm actually going to add the deserts to this map so we can kind of compare them. So we find the deserts mostly around the tropics. Just adding on the deserts. Okay, so the deserts are found along the Tropic of Capricorn, the Tropic of Cancer, whereas the tropical rainforests are found along the equator. So we know that the tropical rainforests are going to be very hot because of their location to the sun, but they're also very wet. So we need to know why tropical rainforests are wet and hot, and why the deserts are dry and hot. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to explain why ecosystems have different climates. So what you're going to need to do is either find a map that looks like the one on the board, or pause the screen and trace the one on the board, or just draw a diagram similar to what I am doing now. So we need to make sure that we have all this information down so that it makes sense. You'll have to pause it as we're going through. So the first thing we need to do is add the equator line to our maps and label this the equator. Now it would also be worth adding on a sunshine here to show that near the equator the sun's rays are the most concentrated. So we're also going to add to our maps the Tropic of Cancer, which is 23.5 degrees north, and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is 23.5 degrees south. Okay, so we know that along the Tropic of Capricorn we have deserts, and similarly along the Tropic of Cancer. And we know along the equator we have tropical rainforests. So why are tropical rainforests wet and why are the deserts hot? Well, because the sun's rays are the most concentrated near the equator, we have got hot air rising. So as this hot air rises and goes into the atmosphere, it will start to cool and create clouds. So it'll cool, it'll condense, and then it will rain. So that is why we have lots of rain occurring on the equator. And this is because of low pressure. So LP equals low pressure. So in low pressurized areas, the air rises, cools, condenses, precipitates. Also another word for rains. Now, once it's rained, these clouds either move north of the equator or south of the equator. Okay, but remember they've already rained, so they're quite empty. So what happens then is that they then are in line with the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, which are bands of high pressure. So I'm just going to add this information on. So this area here is an area of low pressure, and now we're in an area of high pressure. So the air is moved either north or south into areas of high pressure. So if low pressure rises, that means that high pressurized areas sink. Okay, so as no air is rising, no condensation can occur, so therefore there's no rainfall. So as it moves north and south of the equator, this air is then forced to sink, and as it's sinking, it's not going to be able to cool and condense, so there will be no rainfall in these areas. So I'm just going to draw a little thing off here. As the air sinks, it's warming, so no condensation occurs, which is why the deserts are hot and dry. Okay, so this explains why tropical rainforests are very hot and wet. It's because they're in an area of low pressure, and it explains why deserts are very hot and dry. It's because they are in an area of high pressure. So make sure, please, you have all the information down on the board before you move on. Okay, so what I would like you to do to finish is to write down these three answers. So they've got three things here, and I would like you to answer the following questions. So the desert has very low levels of rainfall because, so you have to use the information on here to help you. So in the desert one, you talk about the fact that it's in an area of high pressure, but it's near the equator, so it's still hot. For the tropical rainforest, you talk about the fact it's in an area of low pressure, but it's still near the equator, so it's still hot but wet. And the tundra is very dry because it's an area of high pressure, but it's cold because it's not near the equator, so the sun's rays are less concentrated. So have a go answering those three questions using the word box, which we can see here. So pause it here, answer those questions, and then we've got some more detailed answers on the next slide. Okay, so you might want to pause your video here And make sure you've got down all the things that are written down on the screen. So I've circled them. So blue is talking about 1, green is talking about 2, and red is talking about number 3. And that's all we need to do for this lesson.